The photograph hung crooked in the hallway, but no one dared straighten it. Ever since Grandma Rose left, nothing felt upright. Not the picture frames. Not the family dinners. Not even the air inside the house. The Caldwell house stood proudly on a quiet suburban street in Connecticut, painted in tasteful shades of cream and slate blue. From the outside, it looked like the kind of place where nothing bad ever happened. But inside, beneath the polished wood floors and neatly fluffed cushions, something unspoken festered. Grandma Rose used to say the house felt too quiet, too perfect, like it didn't have any memories soaked into the walls. A real home creaks when it breathes, she would joke. No one ever laughed. Now in her late 70s, Grandma Rose moved slowly, with a cane in one hand and sharpness in her eyes that hadn't dulled despite her body's betrayal. She still cooked Sunday breakfast. She still remembered every grandchild's birthday. But lately, she also misplaced her keys, forgot what month it was, and once set the kettle to boil without water. Her daughter Lydia noticed. And resented it. At 43, Lydia was all clipped tones and tightly coiled hair. She worked as an assistant director at a marketing firm downtown, and ran the household like a campaign. Every schedule printed, every pantry labeled. Her husband Marcus, an insurance adjuster with a fondness for black coffee and silence, rarely looked up from his phone unless someone broke a rule. Their children, Tina, 16, and Marco, 12, orbited the house like cautious satellites. Tina wore headphones constantly. Marco preferred the attic. The family sat down to dinner that Friday evening, as they did every week. The table was laid neatly, rosemary chicken, asparagus, Lydia's signature red wine reduction. Rose always noticed the presentation. She'd raised Lydia to have taste, even if it came with a side of bitterness. "Pass the bread, Grandma?" Marco asked gently. Rose smiled, grateful. She had been quiet most of the evening, distracted by something. She looked toward the ceiling, then at Lydia. "Do you remember that chest in the attic?" she asked softly. Lydia stiffened. "It belonged to your father," Rose continued. "There's something in it I need to show you all." "It's important." Marcus rolled his eyes. "Rose, not this again." "No, listen," she insisted, her eyes clearer than they had been in days. "There's something you need to see. Something I promised to protect." Lydia put her fork down with a sharp clink. "Can we not do this right now?" "But it's time." "No, Mom. It's not." Lydia's voice sharpened, slicing through the room like a cold blade. "You're confusing stories again. There's nothing in that attic except dust and broken furniture." The silence that followed was thick and raw. "I'm not confused," Rose whispered. "I remember everything about that day. I remember the sound of the latch. I remember what he said to me before." "Enough." Lydia snapped. Tina flinched. Marco stared down at his plate. Rose's hands trembled slightly in her lap. Her eyes welled, but she didn't wipe them. She just stared across the table at Lydia, the daughter she had raised alone, through heartbreak and sacrifice. The same daughter who now looked at her like a child who'd grown senile in a rocking chair. Rose reached for her glass of water, held it midair, and then said, quiet but firm, "When I'm gone, you'll see why I had to keep it." The glass touched the table again with a soft clink. No one said a word. Only the crooked photograph in the hallway, tilted like a lopsided memory, bore silent witness to what had just cracked in that room. Lydia found Grandma's trembling hands fumbling with a key she didn't remember owning. It looked old, brass, worn smooth with time, and it was clenched so tightly in Rose's fist that her knuckles turned white. The morning after the awkward dinner, Lydia walked into the living room to find her mother pacing in her nightgown, whispering to herself. Her cane leaned against the armrest, forgotten. The brass key glinted in her hand like a relic from another lifetime. "Where did you get that?" Lydia asked, her tone suspicious more than concerned. Rose looked up, startled. "I've had it for years. It opens the attic chest." Lydia sighed. "We've already talked about this. There's nothing in that trunk but old clothes and broken picture frames." "No," Rose said firmly. There's something I need to show you. It's time. Lydia hesitated. She hated that voice, the confident one that reminded her how Grandma always knew better, always had the last word. But she also noticed something else in Rose's face this time, urgency. And fear. Rose reached for her cane, began moving toward the staircase. Come with me. No, Lydia said quickly, stepping between her and the stairs. You're not climbing anything. You could fall and break your hip. I'll be careful. You'll sit, Lydia cut in. I'll check it myself later. Just, give me the key. Rose clutched it tighter. Her jaw locked. Across the room, Marcus glanced up from his laptop. Why don't you let her check it out, Lydia? Could be interesting. Lydia shot him a look. Don't encourage this. He shrugged. What's the harm? Lydia turned back to her mother. You need to stop living in the past. All these stories, these secrets, they're confusing the kids. You scared Marco last night. Rose's expression dimmed. I just wanted to pass on something important, she said, her voice shrinking. Before I forget. That struck Lydia harder than she expected. Still, she didn't reach for the key. She didn't move. And when Rose finally handed it over, reluctantly, fingers uncurling like a flower dying in slow motion, Lydia pocketed it and left the room without another word. Later that afternoon, Marco sat quietly at the base of the attic stairs, holding a comic book but not reading it. He'd seen the key. He'd seen his mom hide it in her drawer, and more importantly, he had seen the way Grandma's eyes shimmered, not confused, but desperate. He waited until the house was asleep. Around midnight, he crept past the hallway where the crooked photograph still hung. Every step of the wooden stairs creaked under his weight, each one louder than the last. The attic door groaned open like a secret it didn't want to tell. Dust danced in the moonlight filtering through the round attic window. Old furniture lay draped in white sheets. A smell, not musty, but familiar, filled the air, lavender, the scent Grandma wore. He found the trunk tucked in a corner. A heavy thing, metal-bound, with initials carved into the lid. R.S. Marco knelt, took out a bobby pin. Tina taught him how to pick simple locks, and before he could even try, he heard something behind him. Grandma. She stood silently at the top of the stairs, one hand on the wall, the other clutching the key Lydia had taken, somehow retrieved again. Don't be afraid, she said softly. Marco watched as she limped over, breath shaky, and bent down beside the trunk. I buried this so long ago I forgot where the bones were, she said, almost smiling, but they always rise. Sooner or later. With that, she unlocked the chest. Inside were neatly stacked letters tied in red ribbon. A thick manila envelope. A small wooden box with a faded name etched into it. A photograph, a black and white image of a woman holding a baby next to a man Marco didn't recognize. I promised I would protect this until the day came, Grandma whispered. The day you would need to know who you are. Before Marco could respond, something shifted above, a soft creak of floorboard, or maybe a shadow crossing the moonlight. Then, crash. A loud thud. Something had fallen in the attic, just behind them. Marco spun around. The photograph had slipped out of the trunk and lay face up on the floor. The woman in the photo wasn't Grandma. The lock gave way with a sound like a gasp. Grandma's hand hovered, unsure if she wanted them to see. Secrets have weight. This one had waited decades to breathe. Marco knelt beside her, the photograph now in his hand. He turned it over. No date. No names. Just a faint smudge where maybe someone once wrote something, then changed their mind. Who are they? He asked quietly. Grandma Rose didn't answer right away. She reached into the trunk again, carefully removing the letters one by one. Each was yellowed, the ink faded, but the ribbons were perfectly tied, red silk, soft and strong. This was his, she said. Your grandfather's. Before he disappeared. Marco's eyes widened. I thought he died. He did, Rose said. But only after he left something behind no one wanted to talk about. She opened the manila envelope next. Inside, documents. A deed, handwritten. Some bank records. And a will, unsigned. All dated from nearly 40 years ago. Marco scanned the top of one paper. It says, "This land belongs to someone named David." Grandma nodded. Your mother never knew. She was too young. But David, he was my first son. Marco stared at her. You had a son before Mom? Rose's voice caught in her throat. Yes. I had 2 children. Lydia was the second. Downstairs, Lydia sat bolt upright in bed, something gnawing at her sleep. Maybe a dream. Maybe the memory of that damn key. She reached into her nightstand and opened the drawer. Empty. Back in the attic, Grandma carefully lifted the small wooden box from the trunk. It was no larger than a jewelry case, but far heavier. She handed it to Marco. He opened it slowly. Inside, a bundle of old coins, a tiny broken compass, and another envelope. This one was addressed, to Lydia. When she's ready. Grandma took it back before he could open it. Not yet, she said, voice stern. Marco's brow furrowed. Why not? Because readiness isn't about age. It's about truth. And your mother, she's not ready to see me as something more than a burden. She looked around the attic, the old furniture, the dusty rafters. This is the only place that still remembers me. Marco's eyes softened. I remember you. Grandma touched his cheek, and for a moment, her hands didn't shake. Later that morning, Lydia stormed into the attic, hair still wet from a rushed shower, fury simmering just below the surface. Are you kidding me? She barked. You brought him up here? Mom, he's 12. What if you fell? I didn't, Rose said calmly. You took the key. You went behind my back. I gave it to you, Rose corrected. And you hid it like it was dangerous. Lydia turned to Marco. Go downstairs. Now. Marco glanced at Grandma, torn, then obeyed. Alone now, the tension in the attic thickened. You can't keep doing this, Lydia hissed. Every time you feel ignored, you pull out some new story or secret like it gives you power. Rose looked hurt. This isn't about power. It's about history. Yours. Mine. His. She pointed to the chest. Lydia followed her gaze and saw the envelope marked with her name. She reached for it. No, Rose said firmly. Not until you're ready. I am ready, Lydia snapped. Rose stared at her, quiet. Then prove it. She handed Lydia the photograph Marco found, the one of the strange man, woman, and baby. Do you recognize anyone in this? Lydia squinted. No. Should I? That baby is you, Rose said. Lydia blinked. What? That woman, she wasn't me. And the man, he's not the one you think was your father. Lydia's voice turned cold. This is ridiculous. It's the truth, Rose whispered. She reached into the chest and pulled out a second photograph, this one of Lydia, age 3, on the same porch from the other photo, but standing alone. I kept the truth buried, Rose continued. But even buried roots grow. Lydia stared at both photographs. Her hands began to shake. Lydia discovers she is not Grandma Rose's biological daughter, she was adopted under secretive circumstances. Lydia stared at the photograph like it was a lie someone dared to print. This doesn't make sense, she whispered. That's not possible. That baby isn't me. But deep down, she knew it was. The photo showed a chubby-cheeked toddler, eyes wide, smile toothless, standing on a porch Lydia remembered only in broken flashes. And the woman holding her wasn't Grandma. Her skin was darker, her hair straighter. And her hands, Lydia would never forget those hands, they were soft. Gentle. Who is she? Lydia asked, voice flat. Rose sat slowly on the trunk, her hands folded tightly in her lap. Her name was Evelyn. She was your mother. No, Lydia said, standing now. No. You're my mother. I raised you, Rose said quietly. I loved you. I still do. Lydia's breath caught in her throat. Rose continued, your birth mother was very young. 17. Poor. No family. I was a social worker at the time, volunteering at a women's shelter. She had nowhere to go. So you took me? Lydia's voice rose, furious. No. She asked me to. She gave me away? Rose's eyes filled. She was dying, Lydia. She had an untreated infection. She gave you to me, with one condition. Lydia staggered back. What condition? Rose opened the envelope addressed to Lydia. Pulled out a letter, aged, fragile. She handed it over with trembling fingers. Lydia didn't want to take it. But she did. Her eyes scanned the slanted handwriting. If she asks, tell her I loved her more than anything. That I didn't abandon her, I gave her a future. If she's angry, let her be. But tell her the truth when she's old enough to carry it. Lydia folded the letter slowly, hands numb. All her life, she'd believed in the story she was told. Her father died in a car crash, her mother raised her alone with quiet strength and fierce love. And now, none of that was true. Or maybe some of it was. But the betrayal felt complete. I don't even know who I am anymore, Lydia whispered. You're mine, Rose said, almost pleading. Maybe not by blood. But in every way that mattered. Lydia stepped back, shaking her head. You lied to me for 40 years. I protected you. No, you controlled me. They were both crying now. One from regret. The other from rage. Downstairs, Marco sat on the carpet outside the attic, pressing his ear to the door. He heard nothing, but he felt the silence. It wasn't over. In the kitchen, Marcus poured himself a drink. Tina entered, phone in hand, earbuds dangling. Mom and Grandma are at it again, she said casually. Marcus didn't look up. Let them be. Some things need to be fought out. Tina frowned. Marco's upstairs too. Marcus paused. With them? Tina said. Now he's sitting out front with that photo. Just staring. Marcus drained his glass and stood. Back in the attic, Lydia finally looked up from the letter. Her voice was cold and steady now. Does anyone else know? Rose hesitated. Does anyone else know? Rose lowered her head. Your brother did. For a while. Lydia blinked. My what? David, Rose whispered. My son. He was 10 when I brought you home. You told Marco I was the second child, Lydia said, a dawning horror in her voice. You didn't mean second born. You meant, second taken in. I meant second loved, Rose said. He disappeared years later. Left without saying goodbye. He blamed me. Where is he now? Rose's voice broke. I don't know. Lydia turned slowly, walked toward the attic stairs, letter clutched in one hand, photograph in the other. Her mother didn't follow. At the bottom of the stairs, Lydia met Marcus. You okay? He asked, cautious. She looked at him, then right through him. I have a brother, she said. And my mother isn't my mother. She didn't wait for a response. Just walked past him, the floorboards creaking beneath her step. Marcus slammed the front door so hard the walls trembled. Grandma Rose stood frozen at the base of the stairs, the photograph still trembling in her hand. The entire house felt heavier now, like the air had thickened with everything unspoken. Rose sat in the armchair by the window, eyes locked on nothing. She hadn't moved in an hour. Down the hallway, Lydia paced the guest room floor, the letter from Evelyn crumpled in her fist. Her hands shook, but it wasn't anger anymore, it was something worse. Confusion. Grief. She glanced at herself in the mirror, but the reflection looked like a stranger. What do you do when the story you've lived by turns out to be someone else's script? Tina tiptoed past Lydia's door, earbuds in, but paused when she heard her mother's muffled voice inside, not words, just a single choked sob. Tina pulled out one earbud and stood there, torn, before walking away. In the backyard, Marco sat under the oak tree, knees pulled to his chest. The photograph, the one of the unknown couple with baby Lydia, sat on the grass beside him. He kept staring at the man in the image. The jawline looked familiar. He pulled out his phone and started searching online for Evelyn Caldwell and David Caldwell. Nothing useful. But something about the name David kept ringing in his mind like a distant bell. By evening, the family gathered half-heartedly around the dinner table. Rose didn't speak. Lydia didn't look up. Marcus tried to cut the silence with small talk, but it bounced off the walls and landed flat. Tina eventually cleared her throat. So, are we just pretending nothing happened now? Lydia flinched. Enough, Marcus muttered. No, Lydia said suddenly, she's right. Everyone turned. There's a man out there, she said slowly, who I've never met. But apparently, he's my brother. And the reason no one talks about him is because he disappeared. Just vanished. Rose finally lifted her eyes. I don't know where he is, she whispered. I haven't for years. Why didn't you tell me? Lydia asked. Rose hesitated, then said, because I already lost one child. I couldn't risk losing another. You lost him because you kept secrets, Lydia snapped. And now I'm the one drowning in them. That night, Lydia lay awake, staring at the ceiling fan spinning above her. What did it mean, to be raised by someone who had rewritten your origin story? She had always told herself she was strong, disciplined, self-made. But maybe she had been shaped by more than she knew, by absence, by lies, by love given under false pretenses. The next morning, as the house stirred slowly awake, the doorbell rang. Marco answered it. A delivery man handed him a thin, unmarked envelope. For Rose Caldwell, he said. From a return address in New Mexico. Marco frowned. Who's it from? The man tapped the label. Name says. David R. Caldwell. Marco's mouth dropped open. He closed the door slowly, then turned the envelope over in his hands. Before he could call out, Lydia appeared at the top of the stairs. He held up the envelope. It's from him, he said. Lydia descended slowly, took the envelope from his hands like it might explode. The handwriting was clear. Neat. Familiar somehow. She opened it. Inside, a single sheet of paper. And one black and white photo. The photo showed a man, maybe late 40s, standing beside a mailbox with the number 77 spray-painted on it. His eyes looked almost exactly like hers. The note read, If Rose is still alive, tell her I kept my promise. I stayed away. But now. I'm ready to come back. I'm ready to be seen. There was no phone number. No address. Just a postmark, Santa Fe, New Mexico. Lydia stood motionless, the paper shaking in her hands. Mom? Tina said from the kitchen doorway. But Lydia didn't hear her. All she could see were those eyes, her eyes, staring at her from a face she'd never seen. And the words Rose had said the night before echoed in her mind, I already lost one child. David, Grandma Rose's long-lost biological son, arrives unannounced, with a claim to the family estate and a lifetime of resentment. The knock on the door came just as Lydia reached for her coffee. 3 short raps. Measured. Intentional. Like someone who wanted to be let in, or feared they wouldn't be. She opened it without thinking. The man standing there wore a weathered leather jacket, sunglasses tucked into the collar, and an expression that looked like he hadn't smiled in 20 years. He was tall, lean, maybe early 50s, with gray in his beard and a gaze so sharp Lydia took a step back. Lydia? He asked. She hesitated. Yes? He pulled something from his pocket, not a photo, not a weapon, but a worn-out postcard. It had their mailbox number scribbled on it in blue ink. I'm David, he said. Down the hallway, Rose heard the name and dropped her tea. The cup shattered. Everyone came running, Marcus, Tina, Marco, but Rose didn't move. She just stood there, frozen. David, she whispered. In the living room, Lydia handed David a glass of water, her fingers trembling. She stared at him, not because he was familiar, but because something was. Maybe the way he held his jaw. Or how he stood without leaning on anything, like he never trusted walls to hold him up. So, Marcus said, trying to sound neutral. You're Rose's son. David nodded slowly. That's what she told you. Everyone glanced toward Rose. He looked at her now, not with warmth. Not even with hate. Just tiredness. You said you didn't know where he was, Lydia said. I didn't, Rose replied softly. I hadn't heard from him in 27 years. You told me you lost him, Lydia said, her voice rising. But he was never lost. You pushed him away, didn't you? David laughed bitterly. She didn't push. She buried. He pulled out a folder from his bag and tossed it on the table. That's the deed to the land this house sits on. Filed in 1985. Signed by our father, witnessed by a notary, naming me the sole heir. Lydia opened the folder. The document was real. Official. But her hand shook with fury. You're claiming the house? She asked. I'm claiming what's mine, David said. This was supposed to be passed to me. Instead, she gave it to you. I didn't even know I wasn't hers. Lydia barked. And yet here you are, living the life I was supposed to have. Rose tried to speak. David. No, he snapped. You chose her. You made it clear. I was too difficult, too loud, too inconvenient. So you erased me. Tina stood awkwardly behind the couch, eyes wide. Marco, beside her, clutched the armrest like it might anchor him. Lydia finally closed the folder. You show up after 3 decades, and your first move is to stake a claim? I sent letters, David said. She never answered, so now, yes, I came for what's mine. And if it isn't? Marcus asked. David smirked. Then we can let the courts decide. That night, the house felt colder. Tina sat in the hallway, phone in hand, typing something, then deleting it. Over and over. Marco followed David from the kitchen to the guest room, curiosity brimming. Are you really Grandma's first kid? He asked. David looked down at him. Yeah. Where were you all this time? David thought for a second. Far away from lies. In Rose's room, Lydia sat beside her mother. You lied to protect me, she said, and it destroyed both of us. I wanted to protect you from him, Rose whispered. He was angry even as a boy. He wouldn't have handled your truth gently. You didn't handle it gently either. Tears streamed down Rose's cheeks. I thought I could have both of you. I thought, if I just loved you hard enough, the rest would fade. It didn't. The next morning, Lydia came downstairs to find David already dressed, waiting. I made coffee, he said. Like Dad used to. She ignored the mug and went straight to the cabinet. We need to talk. David nodded. Good. Because there's more. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a folded sheet of paper. This isn't just about the land, he said. He handed it over. It was a trust, one that Grandma Rose had set up years ago, naming David as a beneficiary only under one condition: he had to return before her death. And he had to reconcile with Lydia. Lydia stared at the clause highlighted in blue ink. If you don't forgive me, David said quietly, I lose everything. If David gets the land, Tina asked softly, what happens to Grandma's house? Her voice was barely above a whisper, like if she said it too loud, the walls might actually answer. Silence hung over the dining room table. It was supposed to be Sunday breakfast, Grandma Rose's favorite ritual. But the pancakes were cold, the eggs untouched, and no one passed the syrup. Lydia tapped her fork rhythmically against her plate. Marcus stared at the trust document. David sat back, arms crossed, like he'd already moved into the house with his name etched on the mailbox. "I'm not trying to evict anyone," David finally said. "But the house sits on land that's legally mine. That matters." "To you," Marcus muttered. "To a court," David replied. Lydia glared at him. "If you think you can guilt me into forgiveness just to unlock some inheritance." "That's not what this is," David interrupted. "It's exactly what this is," Lydia snapped. "You didn't come back to make peace. You came to collect." Upstairs, Rose lay in bed, the document open beside her like a ghost from her own hands. She'd written that clause in the trust with trembling fingers 20 years ago, foolishly believing that if David ever came home, love would handle the rest. Now that clause had become a battlefield. Later that day, the family sat down with a lawyer, not in a courtroom, but in the Caldwell living room. She was young, sharp, and wore the kind of glasses that made people nervous. "From what I'm seeing," she said, flipping through documents, "David's original deed is valid, but it's superseded by the trust if the conditions are met." "Meaning?" Marcus asked. "Meaning if Lydia forgives him in writing, David gets a stake, maybe even half." Lydia looked up sharply. "Half?" "Yes," the lawyer said. "That's how the trust is structured. But if she refuses, the house reverts to Lydia entirely, under the newer will Rose filed." Rose closed her eyes. David said nothing. That night, Lydia stood on the back porch alone, wine glass in hand. Tina joined her, barefoot, arms wrapped around herself. "Do you think he's lying?" Tina asked. "I don't know," Lydia said. "Part of me wants to believe he's just hurt. But the other part wants to burn everything down before it can be taken from you." Lydia looked at her daughter, surprised. Tina shrugged. "You're more like Grandma than you think." Meanwhile, David sat at the kitchen table with Marco, who was examining the original deed. "This paper is old," Marco said. "Like, typewriter old." "Because it is," David replied. "My father typed it himself." "But why would Grandma override it later?" David's voice softened. "Maybe she knew she messed up. Maybe she wanted to fix it. Or maybe," Marco said, "she wanted Lydia to have something you never could." David's smile faded. Down the hallway, Rose wheeled herself out of bed, the first time in days. She moved slowly, using her walker. Each step seemed heavier than the last, like her past was dragging behind her. She reached the living room just as Lydia was walking back inside. "I thought you'd be asleep," Lydia said. Rose looked up at her daughter, no, at the woman she raised, fed, scolded, protected. The woman who now had the power to decide her son's future. "I'm tired of keeping them apart," Rose said. "I didn't do this," Lydia replied. "You did. I know, but now I have to be the one to fix it?" "No," Rose said. "You have to be the one to decide what kind of legacy you want to leave." Before Lydia could reply, Marco rushed into the room. "Grandma," he said, out of breath. "David's gone." Rose straightened. "What do you mean gone?" "His bag's gone. His room's empty. He left this." He handed Lydia a sealed envelope. She opened it slowly. Inside, a letter from David. "I thought I could earn my way back. But maybe some things are broken for good. I'll be in Santa Fe for 1 more week. If you want to talk, really talk, find me. Otherwise, I'll let the past stay buried." Grandma reveals a new, legally binding will that overrides everything, and sets emotional terms that pit forgiveness against inheritance. "If I die before you fix this," Grandma Rose said, her voice shaking, "then neither of you deserves what I built." It was the first time she'd spoken in 2 days. Lydia stared at her from across the room, unsure whether to be angry, moved, or both. Grandma sat in her chair, wrapped in her shawl, with a small lockbox clutched in her lap. "This doesn't change what he's already filed," Marcus said carefully. "It does," Rose said, eyes flashing, "if you'll stop talking and listen." She placed the lockbox on the coffee table and opened it with a key from around her neck. Inside, one sealed envelope, one notarized will, and a flash drive. Lydia picked up the will. The date on it was recent, just 4 years old. She looked at Rose, startled. "You never told me about this." "I was waiting," Rose said, "to see what kind of people you became." Everyone gathered: Lydia, Marcus, Tina, Marco. The air felt tight. Lydia read aloud. "To my daughter Lydia, who was never born from me, but born to me, I leave this home, the love it held, and the truth it hid. And to my son David, who was never lost but waiting, I leave the land, the legacy, and the memory of what could have been. But," she continued, her voice catching as she reached the next line, "this transfer is only valid if the two of you reconcile in writing, not for my sake, but for the sake of the family that comes after us." Lydia stopped reading. Everyone was silent. Marcus broke it. "She's forcing a peace treaty." "No," Rose said. "I'm offering one." Tina stood. "But what if they don't?" Rose's gaze sharpened. "Then it all goes to the community fund. No inheritance. No land. No house." "What?" Lydia gasped. "The Caldwell Family Fund," Rose confirmed. "I set it up last year. For foster youth aging out of the system." Lydia's head spun. She turned to Marcus. "This is manipulation." "It's also legal," he muttered. Tina whispered, "It's kind of poetic." Later that night, Lydia sat alone in the kitchen with the flash drive from the lockbox. She plugged it into her laptop. On it, a single video file labeled "For Lydia and David, watch together." She hesitated. Then she clicked play. On screen, Grandma Rose sat in the attic, daylight streaming behind her. She looked younger, maybe early 70s, with her hands folded in her lap. "I know you're angry," she began. "And you should be. I failed both of you. Not by loving you, but by keeping you apart." She looked directly at the camera. "David, I couldn't forgive your rage. Lydia, I couldn't forgive your silence. So I built a world where neither of you had to confront each other. But that world was built on sand." She smiled sadly. "This house? This land? It's just wood and dirt. If you let it tear you apart, then it owns you. Not the other way around." Lydia closed the laptop. Her chest ached. In the hallway, Rose's voice called faintly, "Did you watch it?" Lydia appeared in the doorway. "Why didn't you tell me?" "Because forgiveness isn't something you schedule," Rose whispered. "It's something you risk." The next morning, Lydia packed a suitcase. Marcus watched her silently. "You're going to him?" he asked. She nodded. "You really think he'll agree to anything?" "I don't know," she said, "but I have to try." She turned to Tina and Marco. "You two stay here. Watch Grandma." Marco frowned. "What do I tell her if she asks where you went?" Lydia gave a small, exhausted smile. "Tell her I went to save the house." Hours later, Lydia stood outside a small adobe-style motel in Santa Fe, the air dry and the sun sharp overhead. "Room 12. She knocked. The door opened slowly. David stood there. Surprised. Tired. Silent. Lydia said nothing. She just held out the flash drive. "And the will." David stepped back and let her in. Moonlight filtered through the attic's dusty window. David's sobs echoed against boxes Grandma once forbade anyone to touch. Lydia hadn't meant to follow him up there. But grief has gravity. And it pulls the wounded back to origin points. They had barely spoken since she arrived in Santa Fe. Not even during the flight back home together, side by side in silence. The moment they crossed the threshold of the Caldwell house, something shifted. The tension wasn't gone, just repurposed. Now it wasn't about who was right. It was about who was ready. David had barely taken his jacket off before heading to the attic. Lydia waited 2 minutes. Then followed. David sat cross-legged near the trunk, hands shaking slightly. A pile of letters sat beside him, Grandma Rose's writing recognizable even after all these years. She kept everything, he said, eyes fixed on an envelope. Even the ones I sent back unopened. Lydia walked around the room slowly, pausing by an old rocking chair. She touched the curved handle like it was a time machine. She kept your school drawings too, she said. Marco found some last month. David chuckled bitterly. I made that drawing when I was 7. It was a tree. With a tire swing. I wanted one so bad. Lydia sat across from him, legs crossed. She said you used to hide up here during storms. She said that? He asked. Lydia nodded. To Marco. Not to me. David's eyes glistened. She stopped saying things when I stopped listening. They sifted through more letters. Journals. An old Super 8 film reel. At the very bottom of the trunk, they found a separate box, taped shut, labeled only with the word, before. David hesitated. Lydia peeled the tape. Inside, another stack of photographs, newspaper clippings. And one diary, not Grandma's. David flipped the cover open. The first page read, Evelyn. For her daughter, if she ever learns who she is. Lydia's breath caught. They spent the next hour reading together. The entries were raw. Filled with longing. Fear. Love. Evelyn wrote about being 17, pregnant, terrified. About meeting Rose, the woman who would become Lydia's adoptive mother. She writes about you, Lydia whispered. David leaned in. Where? Lydia pointed. Rose has a son. Quiet. Brooding. Protective. I think he's the reason I trust her. David swallowed hard. She remembered me? She trusted you. As the sun began to rise outside the attic window, Lydia handed David a folded letter at the bottom of the box. It was addressed to my daughter. Lydia opened it slowly. It wasn't long. Just one page. You were never abandoned. You were never unloved. I wanted to stay, but life had other plans. You were my courage. Rose was my mercy. I hope one day you forgive both of us. Tears streamed silently down Lydia's face. I was angry for so long, she whispered. But I think I was angrier at not knowing why. David looked at her. And now? I'm still angry, she admitted. But now I know who to forgive. They didn't talk for a while after that. Just sat among the dust and paper ghosts. David finally broke the silence. You want to sign the will? Lydia thought for a long moment. Only if you do too. Hours later, the family sat in the living room. Rose watched as Lydia and David handed the signed documents to the lawyer. It's done, Lydia said. David nodded. Half and half. Rose smiled faintly. That's all I ever wanted. No, David corrected. You wanted us to stop being strangers in the same bloodline, and? We're not, he said. Not anymore. That night, Tina entered the attic for the first time. She found Marco reading Evelyn's diary. What are you doing up here? Trying to understand how families break, he said, so I know how not to. Tina sat beside him. Maybe you start by reading the letters no one wants to read. Marco looked at her. Or by asking the questions no one wanted answered. Lydia's hand shook as she read the signature. It was a name she'd never heard, but a voice she felt deep in her veins. It came in a small, thin envelope. No return address. Tina had found it while cleaning out the drawers in Grandma's old sewing table. Faded ivory paper, creased at the corners. On the front, in tidy cursive, Lydia Caldwell. To be opened by her, and only her. The handwriting was unfamiliar. But the tone felt electric. Inside, one page. Dated 1993. Postmarked from Nashville, Tennessee. Lydia read the first sentence and froze. I don't know if Rose ever gave you my letters, but if you're reading this, I need you to know, I never walked away. I was pushed. The signature at the bottom, Daniel Rivers. Underneath it, scribbled faintly, your father. Lydia dropped the letter. Tina, who'd been hovering nervously nearby, rushed over. Mom? What is it? Lydia didn't speak. She picked up the envelope, walked past Tina, and disappeared into her room. For the first time in days, she locked the door. She spent the next hour researching the name. There were a few false leads, a musician, a truck driver, a retired teacher. Then she found a man in Memphis, former civil rights lawyer. Quiet life. No public presence in over a decade. But the photo in the article, though aged, was unmistakable. It was him. The man from Evelyn's photograph. Lydia zoomed in. The same eyes. Same chin. A smile she had never seen in real life, but now recognized in her own reflection. She texted David, I need to tell you something. About Evelyn. About him. Later that evening, the two of them sat in the backyard, away from the rest of the house. Lydia told him everything. David listened in silence. When she finished, he handed her a matchbox. It was from a diner in Memphis. I think I saw this years ago, he said. In one of Evelyn's letters. You think he's still there? She asked. David shrugged. There's only one way to know. The next day, Lydia made the call. The phone rang 4 times before a soft voice answered. Hello? She froze. Is this Daniel Rivers? A pause. Yes. Who's calling? She hesitated, then said, My name is Lydia. Lydia Caldwell. I think I'm your daughter. The line went completely still. When he finally spoke, it was with a breath she imagined he had been holding for 30 years. Then I owe you 1,000 apologies, and a lifetime of truth. 2 days later, Lydia flew to Memphis. No fanfare. No one from the family came with her. She arrived at a quiet, weather-worn house at the end of a long gravel driveway. The door opened before she could knock. He stood there, older, thinner, hair mostly gray, but there was something calm in his presence. Like the wind before a storm. Neither of them spoke. Then he stepped back. Come in, he said. You look just like her. Inside, the house smelled of cedar and old paper. Books lined every wall. Music played faintly from a record player. A small wooden box sat on the coffee table. Lydia noticed a photograph on the mantel, Evelyn, young and radiant, holding a baby wrapped in a lavender blanket. That's me? She asked. Daniel nodded. She made me promise never to stop writing. Even when the letters came back unopened. She said you were dangerous, Lydia said. He sighed. Only to secrets. They spent hours talking. About Evelyn. About Rose. About the years lost. About the regret that had settled in his bones like arthritis. I never stopped thinking about you, he said, but I thought if I pushed too hard, I'd make it worse. You didn't push, she said. She pulled me so far from you, I didn't even know I was missing anything. They sat in silence after that. Then Daniel reached into the wooden box and pulled out a small cassette tape. She recorded this, he said. A week before she died. I've never played it. I was too afraid. He handed it to Lydia. Maybe you're braver than I was. That night, Lydia sat in her hotel room, cassette in hand, tears dried on her cheeks. She didn't play it. Not yet. She wanted to wait until she was home, until David was beside her, and Rose was strong enough to hear Evelyn's voice echo across decades. But she knew, somehow, that tape held one more secret. Something no one had spoken aloud. Something that might change everything. Marcus tore open the envelope with shaking hands. The investigator's report wasn't what he wanted Lydia to see, it was what he was afraid she would. He'd hired the private investigator weeks ago, back when Grandma Rose started talking nonsense about the past never staying buried. Marcus didn't like loose ends. Especially not ones that could upend his version of a perfect life. He thought it was harmless at first. A curiosity. Now, reading the report, he wasn't so sure. Inside were 2 documents. One confirmed Daniel Rivers was alive and living in Memphis. The other included a background summary, including a dropped lawsuit from decades ago, involving political activism, police brutality, and classified government surveillance. Nothing criminal. But certainly, controversial. Marcus rubbed his temples. He had spent 20 years building Lydia's reputation alongside his own, the suburban house, the church socials, the law firm connections. This could unravel all of it. And yet, she'd gone to see the man anyway. Meanwhile, Lydia returned from Memphis late in the afternoon, holding a cassette tape, her face unreadable. David met her at the front door. "How'd it go?" he asked. She held up the tape. "She left us this," Lydia said. Her voice. Her final message. David took it gently. "Does it say what we think it says?" Lydia shook her head. "I haven't listened yet." Upstairs, Grandma Rose sat in her armchair, blanket over her knees, staring out the window. Her eyes lit up when Lydia entered. "You saw him?" she asked. Lydia nodded. Rose's expression flickered. "Was he angry?" "No," Lydia said. "He was tired. Like a man who'd been waiting his whole life for someone to knock on his door." Rose closed her eyes. "I never hated him. I just feared he'd pull you away from me." "You almost made sure I never found him," Lydia said softly. "I know," Rose whispered. "And I'm sorry." Lydia sat beside her, placing the tape in her lap. "You'll want to hear this. It's from her. From Evelyn." Rose's eyes widened, glassy. For a moment, her hands trembled, not from age, but memory. Downstairs, Marcus watched from the staircase, phone still in hand. He hadn't told Lydia about the investigator. He didn't want to. Instead, he forwarded the report to someone else. That evening, the family gathered in the living room. David inserted the cassette into an old player. He pressed play. Evelyn's voice filled the room, soft, gentle, full of grief and grace. "If you're hearing this, then I've already passed. But I hope my voice finds you in a place of peace. Lydia, my sweet girl. I loved you. I still do. And Rose, thank you. Even when we disagreed, I always knew you loved her too." The message went on, full of tender confessions, secrets, stories. But near the end, her voice changed. "And if Daniel is still out there, tell him I forgive him too. I just wish he hadn't taken the money. That's what kept me from trusting him again." The room froze. David leaned forward. "What money?" Lydia blinked. "He never mentioned that." Marcus watched them both, then looked away. Later that night, Lydia confronted Daniel on a video call. He sighed. "She thought I took it. I didn't. There was an envelope of emergency funds, but I never touched it. Someone else must have." His voice trailed off. "What?" Lydia asked. "I don't know. But I wasn't the only one Evelyn trusted." Back in the Caldwell home, Marcus sat in his office, fingers steepled beneath his chin. He looked at the copy of the PI report again. Then he pulled out a second envelope from his drawer. Inside, a photo of Daniel, from decades ago. Standing outside a protest. Next to a much younger Marcus. Marcus and Daniel have a shared past, and Marcus may have played a role in keeping Lydia and Daniel apart decades ago. The photograph slid out of the envelope like a loaded gun, not violent in itself, but dangerous in what it implied. And Lydia had seen enough law cases to know, paper trails don't lie. It was Tina who found the photo. Buried in the back of Marcus's filing cabinet, beneath old tax documents and car receipts. She wasn't snooping, just looking for printer ink. But when she saw it, she froze. It was clearly Marcus. Younger. Bearded, Standing beside Daniel Rivers at a 1990 protest. And not just standing with him. Smiling. 10 minutes later, Lydia stood in the office doorway, holding the photo. Marcus was seated at his desk, mid-email. She didn't say anything. Just held it up. His face went pale. "Where did you get that?" he asked, too quickly. "You tell me what this is," Lydia said, "or we're done here." Marcus exhaled and leaned back in his chair, eyes closed. "I met him once," he said. "Before you and I ever got together." "That's not what this picture says," she replied. "I was young. In law school. Idealistic. He was a speaker at one of the rallies. We talked. That's all." "But you recognized him," she pressed. "Years later. When I started asking questions. When Grandma mentioned Evelyn. You knew who he was." "I suspected," Marcus admitted. "But I couldn't be sure." "Liar. I didn't want to blow up your life." "No," Lydia snapped, "you didn't want to blow up yours." She stormed out. David intercepted her in the hallway. "What happened?" She handed him the photo. David stared. "Marcus knew my father?" "More than that," she said. "I think he was part of keeping them apart." David's eyes darkened. "What do you mean?" Lydia took a breath. "What if he's the one who took the money Evelyn mentioned? What if Daniel was telling the truth, and someone else made sure those letters never reached her?" David looked stunned. "That would mean he manipulated everything," Lydia finished. "He saw me as a clean slate, no father, no scandal, no ties. And he built a life on that story." Back in the office, Marcus poured himself a glass of scotch, hands trembling. He opened the bottom drawer of his desk. Inside was an old manila folder labeled Evelyn/Rivers. It contained a letter, one Lydia had never seen. Addressed to Rose. Dated 1992. The envelope was unopened. He stared at it for a long time before lighting a match. But before he could drop it into the ashtray, Tina stepped in. "I wouldn't do that," she said, phone camera raised. "Unless you want this whole house to go up in smoke." That night, the family gathered in the living room. No one wanted to speak, but the silence demanded it. Lydia finally broke it. "You lied," she said to Marcus. "You didn't protect me, you erased part of me." "I gave you a life without chaos," Marcus replied, "a name that meant something. A future." "You gave me a cage," she said. "And you called it a castle." David stood. "Did you take the money?" Marcus said nothing. Rose, from her seat, spoke up. "Did you block the letters?" Still nothing. Lydia stepped forward. "Did you ever love me, or just the version of me that fit your story?" That question seemed to shatter something in Marcus's face. "I don't know anymore," he whispered. And then he walked out. Later, Lydia sat beside David with Evelyn's cassette playing again in the background. "You know what's funny," she said. "The man I thought was my enemy, was just scared. And the man I trusted, was hiding everything." David nodded. "Sometimes blood's not the bond that matters. Truth is." She looked at him. "Do you believe we've finally found it?" David looked toward the attic door. "I think we found the part she wanted us to start from." Under the kitchen light, Lydia dropped the phone. Her hands trembled, both lines, to Grandma and to Daniel, waited for her reply. And for the first time, she didn't know who she was answering to anymore. The house had never felt quieter. Marcus hadn't returned since the confrontation. His keys were gone. So was his car. Tina said he left with one suitcase, a box of files, and nothing else. Lydia hadn't heard from him since. She wasn't sure if she wanted to. That morning, Lydia sat in the sunroom with Grandma Rose, both watching the rain bead along the windows. "You were right," Lydia said quietly. "I usually am," Rose replied, with a faint smile. They both laughed, but only for a second. He kept things from me, Lydia said. Not to protect me. To control the narrative. Rose reached over and squeezed her hand. He was a man who feared what he couldn't define. You were never meant to be defined. In the attic, David continued archiving the boxes, letters, photos, even the cassette tapes. Tina and Marco helped, sometimes reading Evelyn's diary entries aloud. It had become a ritual, a kind of sacred excavation. Every family has fractures, David said. Ours just had a whole fault line. Marco looked up. You think it's fixable? David paused. Only if we stop burying things. That night, Lydia stood at the threshold of her bedroom, the light from the hallway behind her, the cassette in her hand. Daniel's voice echoed from their last call, I still want to meet Rose. I still want to sit in the same room as the woman who raised you. Not to blame her. Just to thank her. For what she gave. And what she tried to protect. She hadn't said yes yet. Because it wasn't just about seeing her father, it was about allowing herself to be seen, completely. By both of them. She found David in the kitchen, pouring tea. You still think blood doesn't matter? She asked. David thought for a moment. I think blood makes us relatives. But honesty? That makes us family. She nodded slowly. I want him to come. David smiled. I already invited him. He'll be here tomorrow. Lydia blinked. What? I knew you'd say yes, he said. I just didn't want to wait for you to realize it. The next morning, as the house stirred slowly to life, Rose didn't come downstairs. Tina went up to check and found her awake, but pale. She's not sick, Tina said quietly. Just tired. She said she doesn't want to see anyone until she knows we've fixed what she broke. By noon, Lydia sat in the attic window, Evelyn's diary in her lap, the wind whispering through the open vent. David walked in. She's waiting for us to choose, he said. She's waiting for us to forgive. She's waiting to rest. They looked at each other, then at the room around them, the ghosts and memories and moments stacked in boxes. Lydia finally said, I think I'm ready. David smiled, and then, the doorbell rang. Downstairs, Marco opened the door. Daniel Rivers stood there, hat in hand, eyes wet. Behind him, no suitcase. No flowers. Just the weight of decades in his shoulders. I'm here, he said softly. If she'll have me. Marco led him inside. Lydia met him at the base of the stairs. Neither spoke. They just looked at each other, the silence doing the work. Then, Lydia took his hand. Let's go meet the woman who made us both. Under the kitchen light, Lydia dropped the phone. Her hands trembled, both lines, to Grandma and to Daniel, waited for her reply. And for the first time, she didn't know who she was answering to anymore. The house had never felt quieter. Marcus hadn't returned since the confrontation. His keys were gone. So was his car. Tina said he left with one suitcase, a box of files, and nothing else. Lydia hadn't heard from him since. She wasn't sure if she wanted to. That morning, Lydia sat in the sunroom with Grandma Rose, both watching the rain bead along the windows. You were right, Lydia said quietly. I usually am, Rose replied, with a faint smile. They both laughed, but only for a second. He kept things from me, Lydia said. Not to protect me. To control the narrative. Rose reached over and squeezed her hand. He was a man who feared what he couldn't define. You were never meant to be defined. In the attic, David continued archiving the boxes, letters, photos, even the cassette tapes. Tina and Marco helped, sometimes reading Evelyn's diary entries aloud. It had become a ritual, a kind of sacred excavation. Every family has fractures, David said. Ours just had a whole fault line. Marco looked up. You think it's fixable? David paused. Only if we stop burying things. That night, Lydia stood at the threshold of her bedroom, the light from the hallway behind her, the cassette in her hand. Daniel's voice echoed from their last call, I still want to meet Rose. I still want to sit in the same room as the woman who raised you. Not to blame her. Just to thank her. For what she gave. And what she tried to protect. She hadn't said yes yet. Because it wasn't just about seeing her father, it was about allowing herself to be seen, completely. By both of them. She found David in the kitchen, pouring tea. You still think blood doesn't matter? She asked. David thought for a moment. I think blood makes us relatives. But honesty? That makes us family. She nodded slowly. I want him to come. David smiled. I already invited him. He'll be here tomorrow. Lydia blinked. What? I knew you'd say yes, he said. I just didn't want to wait for you to realize it. The next morning, as the house stirred slowly to life, Rose didn't come downstairs. Tina went up to check and found her awake, but pale. She's not sick, Tina said quietly. Just tired. She said she doesn't want to see anyone until she knows we've fixed what she broke. By noon, Lydia sat in the attic window, Evelyn's diary in her lap, the wind whispering through the open vent. David walked in. She's waiting for us to choose, he said. She's waiting for us to forgive. She's waiting to rest. They looked at each other, then at the room around them, the ghosts and memories and moments stacked in boxes. Lydia finally said, I think I'm ready. David smiled, and then, the doorbell rang. Downstairs, Marco opened the door. Daniel Rivers stood there, hat in hand, eyes wet. Behind him, no suitcase. No flowers. Just the weight of decades in his shoulders. I'm here, he said softly. If she'll have me. Marco led him inside. Lydia met him at the base of the stairs. Neither spoke. They just looked at each other, the silence doing the work. Then, Lydia took his hand. Let's go meet the woman who made us both. She stood at the old boundary, wind whipping the document into her palm, heart throbbing with years of unspoken truths. Rose Caldwell had one last thing to give, and it wasn't the land. The next morning was unusually still. No birdsong. No breeze. Just silence, soft and deliberate, like the house was holding its breath. Lydia entered her mother's room before anyone else. Rose lay peacefully in bed, hands folded, face turned toward the window. The same cassette recorder from the night before sat beside her on the nightstand. It had stopped playing. The tape had run out. Lydia knew, even before she touched her mother's hand, that she was gone. They didn't call it a death. Not out loud. David called it a passing. Marco said she became part of the land. Tina whispered, she just let go. Daniel stood beside Lydia that evening, both of them watching the sun fall behind the same boundary line where it all began. She waited for the right moment, he said. She always did, Lydia replied. The will was filed the following week. There were no disputes. The land was split equally between Lydia and David, but more importantly, and more surprisingly, so was the ownership of Grandma's legacy. The house, the letters, the diaries, even the tape recordings, everything was archived, then donated to the local community history center under the name, the Rose Caldwell Legacy Project, a house built on secrets, rebuilt with truth. The memorial was simple. Held in the backyard. No pulpit. No religious overtones. Just family, neighbors, and people whose lives Rose had quietly shaped over decades, foster kids she once mentored, women from her church group, nurses from the local clinic. They each placed a flower at the base of her favorite tree. No one cried loudly. But no one smiled falsely either. It was real. Grounded. Earned. After the memorial, Lydia found herself alone in the attic. The wind blew through the open window. Dust floated like memory. She stood in front of the old trunk, the one where it all began. This time, she didn't open it. She just sat beside it. David joined her moments later. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. Everything that mattered had been said. Downstairs, Marco placed the cassette recorder in a glass display case, beside Evelyn's diary and Rose's first letter to Lydia. Tina adjusted the label underneath. Voices that raised us. Weeks passed. Then months. And something remarkable happened: peace. Not the performative kind, but the slow, satisfying peace of understanding. Daniel stayed in town. Not always present, but always reachable. He and Lydia began walking together every Sunday morning, visiting the tree line where Evelyn and Rose's lives had once collided. David started a mentorship program in Rose's name. Tina joined as a student archivist. Marco began writing stories based on forgotten women in family history. His first one, The Woman in the Photograph. On the 1-year anniversary of Rose's passing, the family gathered again. Just them. No guests. No speeches. Just a photo. A new one. Taken at sunset. David and Lydia, standing under the tree. Daniel beside them. Tina and Marco seated on the grass. 3 generations. No lies between them. The photo now hangs in the hallway where the old, crooked one used to be. This one is level. Balanced. Whole. No longer hiding anything. In her final letter, the one Lydia opened weeks after the funeral, Rose wrote just one sentence: "Thank you for letting me love you in the only way I knew how." And Lydia, reading that alone in the attic, whispered through her tears, "I finally understand."